Hello and welcome. I am Therapy Snack, and today we're going to be covering off on the topic of involuntary celibacy and mass violence. For the agenda for this video essay, we're going to go over the introduction, we're going to go over what involuntary celibacy is, the origin and kind of research critiques involving research on involuntary celibacy, the concept of population heterogeneity, some characteristics of risk, and then we're going to get into homicide suicide, mass murder suicide, pathways to mass murder suicide, the concept of social scripting, the importance of considering reverse causality, and then finally concluding remarks. So without further ado, we will begin. Mass violence in institutional settings has generated sustained academic, political, and public attention. Educational facilities, in particular, have become focal points for examining the intersection of individual grievance, psychological distress, and opportunistic target selection. Against this backdrop, the concept of involuntary celibacy has moved from an obscure online label into a prominent analytical category. Several high-profile offenders referenced romantic rejection, sexual frustration, or online communities associated with inceldom, prompting claims that this population represents a distinct motivational pathway for violence. The reaction has been immediate: expanded research output, increased scrutiny of online subcultures, and renewed attempts to determine whether incel-linked violence constitutes a coherent phenomenon. Agencies, media organizations, and academic institutions have treated the category as potentially salient, even as definitions, boundaries, and evidentiary standards remain inconsistent. This environment has produced a rapid rise in discussions about the origins and causality of violence allegedly linked to incel ideology, alongside a notable increase in research focused on the incel community and the broader construct of involuntary celibacy. This introduction works to establish the necessity of context for examining those claims. Before assessing ideological content, developmental factors, or forensic characteristics, it is essential to clarify what involuntary celibacy denotes, how inceldom has been conceptualized in contemporary research, and what the empirical record currently supports. Having introduced our topic, it is perhaps now highly beneficial to further elaborate on the concept of involuntary celibacy. The term involuntary celibate originated in Canada in 1997, and it was coined, interestingly, by a female university student to describe unwanted romantic isolation. The original usage aligned more with what would now be considered the femcel space or movement, an online female kind of venting context rather than a grievance-orientated male-centered identity. The current configuration of incel, therefore, kind of bears very little in resemblance to its origin. However, it is perhaps important to note that some of what does carry over is the kind of grievance-based, romantic-related context and online situation of the movement that has remained consistent and persistent across time. Prior to 2014, generally speaking, research on incels was negligible. The literature consisted primarily of form scraping and content analyses, largely descriptive and generally focused on language patterns and thematic analysis rather than individual psychology. This early work established only that the community existed online, that its rhetoric was often hostile, frequently described as misogynistic, and that little was known about the underlying population itself and the members that comprised it. Contemporary research now conceptualizes incels as a primarily online subculture of men who construct an identity around a perceived inability to form sexual or romantic relationships. Two elements are consistent across datasets. Firstly, that the incel identity is self-applied, and that it is typically anchored to a persistent sense of romantic failure. It's not transient, it's not seen as a phase, but rather as a kind of permanency. The category of incel, though, it is important to note, is heterogeneous. The The unifying mechanism, though, that underpins it is not. The interpretation of unsuccessful mating outcomes as stable, dispositional, and externally caused, often with a biologically kind of essentialist take, is a frequent theme. Within the community, this perception is often formalized through a specific lexicon or kind of formulae and milieu of Chads and Stacys, which are used as shorthand labels that kind of encode the belief that sexual and romantic success is monopolized by a small subset of genetically advantaged men and attractive women. The terminology itself, interestingly, functions both as an explanatory framework and a cognitive shorthand for status asymmetries. The claim is, simply put, that mate selection operates through a highly skewed evolutionary dynamic in which incels occupy a stable, non-competitive position at the bottom of the hierarchy. Evolutionary psychology is routinely invoked to legitimize this worldview. Members interpret research on mate preferences, sexual dimorphism, status competition, intrasexual competition, intersexual selection, and all of the sort that demonstrate that women prefer high status, physically dominant, materially wealthy males, and that these preferences render some men categorically excluded from mating opportunities, often by virtue of deterministic, stable, inherited traits. There is partial alignment with empirical findings. Physical attractiveness and resource acquisition do play measurable and significant roles in mate selection, but the community tends to generalize these effects to well past the point of determinism, often ignoring moderating variables such as personality, warmth, or prosocial traits, or context, or availability that often highly guide these kinds of dynamics. In fact, if you're interested in learning a little bit more about what is being referred to here, which is assortative mating, I actually have a video on that as well, which goes into some of the ecological nuance that's not really heavily discussed in public conversation. But again, I think that's an important aside unto itself. So please feel free to check that out if you're interested. However, getting back to kind of the topic at hand here, Costello's own quantitative work notes this distortion of kind of deterministic evolutionary psychology interpretations, but in a kind of different way. Incels statistically overestimate the weight of appearance and wealth and underestimate non-physical traits in predicting romantic outcomes. This miscalibration is acknowledged in the literature, though the extent of that miscalibration remains a point of debate. Namely, there is significant debate about stated versus revealed preferences in both men and women in dating dynamics, the kind of underlying theory being, in essence, that as kind of wanting to appear virtuous, people may say, oh, I don't really care about looks, particularly women in this example, in order to kind of appear as more virtuous and not as superficial or, for lack of a better word, vapid. There is a counter argument to that, which is that obviously there is also just availability and constraints. It doesn't really matter what people want in their fantasy version. It kind of matters what they actually select for. Again, there is a fair amount of debate here, but the point is that the miscalibration degree between, what is real and what is not is certainly kind of contested, but it absolutely exists insofar as the evidence provides. The identity of kind of involuntary celibacy also emerges from prolonged exposure to online communities that function as interpretive environments. Daly and Nichols show that members frequently differentiate between sincere posts and shitposting, noting that exaggerated misogyny, nihilism, and hostile kind of behavior and attitudes and expressions serve performative kind of quasi-pro-social functions, if you can call it that. This dynamic does not negate the sincerity of core grievances, but does illustrate the difficulty in inferring stable beliefs from form rhetoric alone. That matters for criminological analysis because that can mean that the terminology itself is not really what is of interest, but the underlying cognitive structure. A persistent attribution of mating failure to immutable traits, a belief that sexual markets are hierarchically stratified and that the interpretation of oneself as structurally excluded is critical, are kind of all elements that make up the form of the psychological substrate of the incel identity as understood in the current research. A final methodological issue requires emphasis. The early literature relied almost exclusively on form scraping and static content analysis, which I've referred to a couple times here, And Daly and Nichols is probably the best source for this, and make it very explicit that this approach introduces a severe ecological fallacy. Aggregated online rhetoric is treated as if it directly reflects individual beliefs, despite the absence of any mechanism to verify its sincerity, context, or intent. Unlike traditional qualitative methods, interviews, phenomenology, ethnographic immersion, online scraping provides no opportunity for follow-up, clarification, or validity checking. Posts may be performative, sarcastic, nihilistically exaggerated, or strategically antisocial, and participants themselves acknowledge that much in many of the posts of extreme content, which functions as an in-group bonding practice rather than a statement of personally endorsed ideology. This creates a structural validity problem. Without assessing whether individuals actually hold the beliefs they express performatively, conclusions drawn from raw form text have sharply limited inferential value. Daly and Nichols argue that incel researchers must explicitly account for these distortions. Online hostility is not automatically equivalent to a stable cognitive orientation, and treating it as such risks mischaracterizing the population, overstating ideological commitment, and obscuring the psychological heterogeneity that emerges once actual self-identified incels are interviewed or surveyed directly. Although incels are often portrayed as a coherent ideological bloc, quantitative studies consistently demonstrate substantial heterogeneity within the population. Once the analysis shifts from form rhetoric to individual level data collected through validated psychological instruments, a clear, though far from uniform, profile emerges. Efforts to survey incels directly have revealed predictable methodological obstacles. Daly and Nichols, for example, report that even in structured data collection, respondents sometimes provide deliberately unserious answers, for example, listing their age as 69 or 0, and I imagine in the near future, if and when this is repeated, probably 67, and of course other just obvious fabrications. These requiring list-wise exclusion in order to maintain dataset integrity. These artifacts reinforce the earlier point. Sincerity cannot be assumed in this population, and quantitative work must be filtered through strict validity controls. And, of course, similarly, qualitative work as well. After employing these controls, however, the remaining data across multiple studies converge on a remarkably stable psychological constellation. Costello and related work repeatedly identify low self-esteem, elevated loneliness, depressive symptoms, and significant anxiety as central features. This profile appears not as an incidental finding, but rather as a fairly robust pattern replicated across independent samples. Another consistent theme is the perception of marginalization. Incels report substantively higher rates of social exclusion, bullying, and cumulative interpersonal rejection than non-incel male peers. The abuse pattern is notable. It is overwhelmingly social, rather than physical, and often chronic rather than situational. This developmental history likely contributes to both the negative self-schema and external locus of control observed in the group, though, of course, that is, at this point, speculative, though well-informed. Self-perceived mate value is similarly depressed relative to comparison samples. This aligns with both the expressed identity, constructed around perceived romantic undesirability, and the broader psychopathological pattern. Importantly, this lowered mate value perception is not merely an attitudinal artifact. Quantitative measures show that incels set lower minimum mate preferences than non-incel males. This finding directly contradicts the narrative derived from earlier form scraping that incels hold unrealistically high standards or entitlement-driven expectations. The empirical record indicates the opposite. Incels adjust their minimum stated preferences downward, consistent with perceived low mate value and anticipated rejection. Taken together, these data produce a coherent, clinically relevant picture. Incels are not psychologically uniform, but the subgroup reachable through quantitative instruments exhibits a combination of low self-esteem, perceived marginalization, adverse social history, diminished mate value perception, and lowered minimum preferences. This cluster, recurrent across Costello, Ellenberg, and Moskalenko, which I probably butchered, my apologies, and others, constitutes the evidence-based foundation for understanding inceldom at the individual level rather than through aggregates of online rhetoric that are decontextualized. Perhaps most importantly, from a policy perspective, despite sustained public attention, the empirical incidence of incel-perpetrated violence remains exceptionally low. Estimates that individuals identifying with or retrospectively associated with incel ideology ranged typically close to 59 people worldwide. This figure stands against population estimates placing the broader incel community in the tens to hundreds of thousands within the United States alone. On its face, this represents an extraordinarily small conversion rate from identity to lethal violence. Misogynistic attitudes are present in the online ecosystem. However, quantitative assessments show low endorsement of actual violence, poor alignment between ideological expression and violent intent, and weak correlations between incel-related belief systems and measurable radicalization. Much of the extreme rhetoric identified in content analysis reflects performative, exaggerated, or socially motivated expression rather than genuine operational ideology. Perhaps most notably, Ellenberg and colleagues propose a tripart differentiation within the incel population: hopers, internalizers, and externalizers, based on psychological orientation and coping style. Their findings indicate no meaningful difference in life adversity or online form usage across these groups, which is perhaps most instructive when we think about radicalization through exposure. The principal distinction is behavioral. Externalizers display greater risk for violent or aggressive conduct relative to internalizers and hopers. This subgroup is characterized not by ideological extremity, but by a notable developmental marker: a consistent absence of childhood friendships. Ellenberg and colleagues interpret this as a potential indicator of impaired socialization, with relevance for understanding vulnerability to externalizing pathology, rather than incel ideology per se. Taken together, the available research indicates that incel-linked violence is statistically rare, ideologically diffuse, and more strongly associated with individual psychopathology, particularly externalizing tendencies, than with the doctrinal content of the incel subculture. The distinction between performative hostility and actionable grievance remains central to the interpretation of the risk landscape. Having just covered the previous slide, it is perhaps very notable that a critical pattern within the small number of incel-attributed attacks that actually do occur is consistent with the presence of self-directed violence. Hoffman and colleagues note that incel incidents frequently terminate in suicide or behaviors functionally equivalent to suicide, such as provocation of lethal force by law enforcement. This feature is not incidental. It situates these events within a distinct criminological and forensic framework that extends well beyond the incel literature. The behavioral configuration involved, planned homicidal action followed by self-inflicted death, aligns with the broader categories of homicide-suicide and mass murder-suicide. These forms of violence have been extensively examined outside of the context of inceldom, and the empirical characteristics of those phenomena map closely onto the documented incel cases: entrenched suicidality, grievance fixation, perceived personal injustice, and a deteriorating psychological trajectory preceding the attack. Recognizing this overlap is methodologically important. It redirects analysis away from the subcultural ideology and identity as a primary causal agent and towards a well-established clinical and criminological pattern in which homicide functions as an extension of self-destruction. Incel-attributed attacks, when they occur, conform more reliably to this framework than to models of ideological extremism or collective political violence. This relationship provides the analytical bridge to the next section, where homicide, suicide, and mass murder-suicide are examined directly, using established typologies and the wider literature that predates and exceeds contemporary incel scholarship. Homicide-suicide is defined as the killing of one or more individuals, followed shortly thereafter by the suicide of the perpetrator. Knoll emphasizes that the temporal proximity is essential. The suicide is not incidental, delayed, or unrelated, but structurally integrated into the violent act. This category of offending is socio-demographically distinct from typical homicide and is comparatively rare. The offender profile diverges from patterns seen in conventional criminal homicide. Homicide-suicide perpetrators are older on average, more likely to be male, more likely to have a history of depression or relationship instability, and less likely to have prior criminal involvement. The phenomenon is also contextually constrained. Homicide-suicide as a general concept is overwhelmingly present in intimate or familial domains, comprising roughly 50 to 75% of all documented cases. Filiacide suicide represents a notable subset. Knoll, for example, reports that 40 to 60% of fathers and approximately 15 to 20% of mothers who kill their children subsequently die by suicide, excluding neonates. These features reflect not generalized homicidal intent, but a psychologically cohesive pattern in which self-destruction and the killing of others exists within a unified motivational framework. Taken together, homicide-suicide represents a discrete behavioral subtype, rare, internally coherent, and anchored in suicidality rather than instrumental aggression. Its dynamics and offender characteristics lay the groundwork for understanding the even narrower category of mass murder-suicide, which aligns more directly with the behavioral signature present in the small number of incel-attributed attacks. Turning now to the perhaps more notable manifestation of violence is the concept of mass murder, and specifically mass murder-suicide. Mass murder is conventionally defined as the killing of 4 or more victims within a single incident. Knoll notes that in a majority of such cases, the event terminates with the suicide of the perpetrator, which is a frequent characteristic of mass murder. This feature is not incidental, similar to homicide-suicide, but is rather central to the behavioral architecture of mass murder-suicide. The offender's self-destruction is embedded within the attack plan itself. Early research on mass murder-suicide consistently identified 3 domains of psychological themes. The first is intense anger and revenge, typically rooted in accumulated grievance rather than opportunistic aggression. The second is a profound social alienation, characterized by chronic interpersonal isolation, perceived ostracism, or entrenched failure in relational domains. The third and final is the presence of pre-attack behavioral leakage, especially threats, ideation disclosure, hostility statements, or other forms of signaling that precede the event. Psychological autopsy studies of the perpetrators who survived their attacks, individuals who, by chance rather than intention, did not complete their planned suicide, provide further clarity. Knoll reports that these subjects had all been bullied or isolated during childhood and subsequently became socially isolative and despairing. This developmental trajectory is consistent across cases: prolonged social marginalization, entrenched hopelessness, and a progression from self-directed despair toward outwardly directed violence. Essentially, externalization. Mass murder-suicide thus reflects a coherent offender subtype, grievance-saturated, psychologically deteriorated, and fundamentally orientated around suicidality rather than instrumental gain. Its established characteristics align closely with the limited but well-documented incel-attributed attacks, providing a more empirically appropriate framework for your understanding their etiology than models centered on ideological radicalization. Of course, a cursory review of incel-attributed attacks shows clear ideological framing. I would be remiss to mention it. References to belief systems, self-ascribed labels, and in some cases even explicit manifestos. On the surface, these materials appear to support a straightforward ideological interpretation, and it is common for observers to take the textual content of offender communications at face value. This assumption is understandable, but analytically unsound. In cases where homicide and suicide are fused, the stated ideological rationale often obscures a deeper and more clinically relevant motivational structure. This distinction matters because incel-attributed attacks have increasingly been discussed in the language of terrorism, with calls to classify incel ideology as a form of extremist violence. If the goal is to understand these acts through a terrorism framework, the appropriate analog is suicidal terrorism, not conventional political extremism, given the previously discussed suicidality associated with incel-related attacks. And suicidal terrorism, despite its ideological surface, has been shown repeatedly to rest on psychological dynamics far closer to mass murder suicide than to ideologically driven instrumental violence. For this reason, reviewing the literature on ideologically framed MMS, particularly suicide terrorism, is essential. It clarifies that ideological content cannot be interpreted as proof of non-suicidal intent, and that offenders who present as ideologically motivated frequently exhibit underlying suicidality, psychosocial deterioration, and grievance saturation that align with a broader MMS offender typology rather than with doctrinally driven political violence. Historically, ideologically motivated mass murder suicide, particularly suicide terrorism, often in the form of suicide bombing, was classified as non-suicidal. Classic models portrayed the perpetrators as ideologically driven, cognitively intact actors executing strategic, planned violence under conditions of unwavering belief or blinded fervor. The dominant assumption was that the suicide component reflected tactical necessity rather than genuine self-destructive intent. This model is no longer supported by the empirical literature. Langford 2010 and Sheehan 2014 demonstrate that the earlier classification systematically misinterpreted offender psychology and relied on unverified assumptions about ideological purity and motivation. Sheehan's review shows that when suicide terrorists are evaluated through controlled psychological testing and structured interviews, the findings shift dramatically. A substantial proportion exhibited suicidal tendencies, prior suicide attempts, depressive symptoms, and significant psychosocial impairment. In Mariari's controlled study, as summarized by Sheehan, approximately 40% of would-be suicide bombers displayed measurable suicidal tendencies on standardized tests, and 13% had prior attempts unrelated to terrorism, whereas none of the matched controls did. These rates substantially exceeded population baselines and contradict the notion that suicide terrorists are psychologically insulated from suicidality. Sheehan notes that the older frameworks overemphasize the necessity of pre-existing psychopathology, particularly depression, which we now know not to necessarily be requisite for suicide, while misunderstanding the etiology of suicide, which often centers on impulsivity, rumination, and impaired self-regulation rather than affective sadness. And this is probably a good time to have a brief aside that I do actually have a video on this, the biology of suicide, which covers this actually in depth from a biological perspective. But without further ado and continuing, what you should gather from this is that the qualitative record reinforces this interpretation. One would-be bomber, infamously or famously, depending on how you interpret it, stated, "I wanted to kill myself. I used to stand in front of Israeli tanks, hoping they would shoot me. Then I met people who offered me the chance to carry out an act of martyrdom. I had been thinking for a long time about the opportunity to die. And when these men showed up, I said to myself, this was a good opportunity." Such statements indicate the offense was opportunistically aligned with self-destructive pre-existing intent rather than produced by ideological conviction alone. Psychological autopsy material further reveals that many perpetrators are already burdened by guilt, shame, interpersonal crises, and persistent failure in core life domains. Their inability to maintain employment, relationships, or family stability erodes self-worth. As Robbins and Post, 1997, I believe is cited by Sheehan, note, although outward blame may be directed towards external enemies or political actors, beneath the discontent with society is discontent with the flawed self. This internalized despair, not ideological purity, forms a psychological substrate of ideologically framed mass murder suicide. The contemporary literature, therefore, rejects the earlier assumption that suicide terrorism is fundamentally non-suicidal. Instead, it aligns with MMS dynamics, entrenched suicidality, grievance, rumination, and psychosocial deterioration. This correction is essential for understanding other modern offender categories, including the small subset of incel-attributed attacks that exhibit the same motivational architecture under a different ideological surface. Everything we've stated and gone through thus far gets us to the concept of the final act and scripting. Among public mass murder suicide offenders, the behavioral pattern most consistently replicated across the literature is the final act mindset. Silver reports that only 17% of mass murder perpetrators display any meaningful intention to escape. This finding aligns with earlier analyses that we went through, where the offender does not behave like a person attempting to avoid apprehension, but rather an individual enacting a final, irreversible episode. The operational goal is a combination of personal death and functional death, the termination of one's social identity and psychological presence. A second component is social scripting. Mullen, as cited by Knoll, identifies the recurrent theme of going out as a culturally embedded script that provides offenders with a similar/familiar narrative structure for their final act. These scripts function as templates, simplifying decision-making and offering symbolic coherence at a moment characterized by psychological disintegration. Silver extends this by documenting grievance rectification as a central narrative element. The perception that the attack is an opportunity to resolve accumulated injustices, redress humiliation, or deliver symbolic retribution before self-destruction. Within this framework, suicide is primary, not secondary. Joyner, as summarized by Silver, argues that in mass murder suicide, the homicide is an extension of the already established suicidal trajectory. The perpetrator does not kill and then decide to die. The perpetrator intends to die and integrates homicide into the suicidal plan as a means of expressing grievance, enhancing symbolic impact, or securing final recognition. This pattern is further supported by large-scale behavioral analysis. Langford notes that public mass shooters almost never attempt genuine escape. Osborne and Kaplan, 2016, report that only 15% of offenders leave the attack site at all, with half of those ultimately surrendering and the other half dying shortly after flight. Horgan et al. Found that across cases, whether ending in suicide, responder engagement, or survival, only 17% of offenders again displayed any escape behavior. This is, again, Silver summarizing. And even those attempts were typically perfunctory. Collectively, these findings confirm that the attack is conceptualized as a final free act, executed with an understanding that self-annihilation will follow. The operational script is not orientated towards survival, negotiation, or evasion. It is orientated towards closure, personal, psychological, and symbolic. All of this drags us closer to the end in the conclusion, which is largely regarding causality, specifically theoretical structuring of causality. Establishing causality in behavioral science requires directional evidence. Without demonstrating temporal precedence and isolating competing explanations, correlations between an ideology and a behavioral outcome cannot be interpreted causally. This constraint applies directly to claims that incel ideology produces violent action. The central issue is directionality. If violent offenders occasionally reference incel terminology or produce ideologically framed communications, this does not clarify whether the ideology shaped the violence or whether pre-existing psychological deterioration shaped the adoption of the ideology. The sequence is ambiguous. Individuals with entrenched suicidality, grievance saturation, externalizing pathology, or deteriorating social functioning may gravitate towards ideological material that resonates with their internal state. In this case, the ideology is not causal, it is epiphenomenal. This is the reverse causality problem. Without longitudinal data demonstrating that ideological adoption precedes and produces a shift towards violent behavior, the direction of influence cannot be inferred. The alternative, that the predisposition shapes the selective ideological uptake, is at least as plausible and, given the homicide, suicide, and mass murder suicide literature, considerably more congruent with well-known offender typologies. This limitation is not incidental, it is foundational. Behavioral science cannot assign causal weight to an ideology purely based on the basis of retrospective ideological expression. In the absence of directional evidence, attributing violence to incel ideology collapses into post hoc inference. The more parsimonious explanation, supported by the broader MMS framework, is that the underlying predisposition, suicidality, alienation, externalization, drives both the violence and the occasional adoption of ideologically coded language, not the other way around. In summary, the empirical record demonstrates that incel-attributed violence is an exceptionally rare outcome relative to the size of the broader incel-identified population. The rarity is not meaningless. It reflects the fact that the psychological and behavioral profiles of these offenders are far more consistent with established mass murder-suicide and homicide-suicide typologies than with ideological extremism. Across cases, suicidality, profound social alienation, entrenched grievances, and psychosocial decline emerge as the primary motivators. The homicide component is integrated into a suicidal trajectory rather than generated by doctrinal commitment. This is evident in the final act operational pattern. The absence of escape behavior and the functional scripting that frames the attack as a terminal event. Ideological material, whether incel-specific or more diffuse, is better understood as a contextual narrative adopted by individuals already on a trajectory towards self-destruction and externalization. Directionality cannot be inferred from the retrospective manifesto content. The available data supports the inverse sequence. Deterioration precedes ideology, not the reverse. Methodologically, this is reinforced by the limitations of form scraping research, which cannot establish sincerity, belief strength, or causality. The individual level quantitative studies reveals a very different picture. High rates of depression, anxiety, loneliness, perceived marginalization, and weakened social bonds. These variables map directly onto the broader MMS literature and do not support an extremism-driven model. Taken together, the totality of the evidence indicates that incel-attributed attacks are not products of ideological radicalization, necessarily, but of pre-existing suicidality and deteriorating psychosocial conditions. The incel identity serves primarily as a framing device for grievance, not as a causal mechanism for violence.